Ladies and gentlemen, the 1940s saw two Queenslanders very briefly occupy the office of Prime Minister without facing an electoral test. Labor's Frank Ford, John Curtin's deputy and Prime Minister for just 8 days after Curtin's death. And Arthur Fadden, who joked after crossbenchers brought his government down that, like the Great Flood, he had reigned for 40 days and 40 nights. But Queensland would have to wait almost 100 years from Andrew Fisher's first minority government in 1908 to see another Queenslander elected Prime Minister. And you'll hear from that Queenslander, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, shortly. In fact, Kevin Rudd is not just from the same state as Andrew Fisher. The place where Kevin grew up, Eumundi, is currently in the federal electorate of Fairfax. But 100 years ago, at the historic election we are here to celebrate, it was in the Wide Bay electorate that Andrew Fisher represented. So Eumundi has the distinction of being responsible for both the Queenslanders elected Prime Minister in the past 110 years. So although Kevin did not have to emulate Andy Fisher's campaigning and take to horseback to reach voters where the roads didn't run, I can personally attest to the extraordinary effort and the hard work that Kevin put in during the 2007 campaign. Like his fellow Queenslander and predecessor, Kevin Rudd has a remarkable achievement to his name, becoming only the 5th Australian Labor leader to win an election from opposition, bringing the 11.5 long years of the Howard government to a close. The man we're here tonight to celebrate, Andrew Fisher, was the very first Australian Labor leader to win an election from opposition. In fact, he was the first leader of a Labor Party in the world to win victory in a national election. That victory made Fisher the first national leader of a Labor government to have a majority in any country in the world. It made him the first ever Australian Prime Minister to command a majority in the Senate as well as the House of Representatives, with 43 House of Representatives seats out of 75 and 23 senators out of 36. Fisher was the first Australian Prime Minister to be elected rather than to emerge from negotiations for support between minority parties. You could say he was the first Australian Prime Minister to have a clear mandate from the electorate, and he was the first Australian Prime Minister to have the numbers in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and to be able to pursue the legislative program he had been elected to enact. He'd have to wait 4 more years to become, in 1914, the only Australian Labor Prime Minister elected with more than 50% of the primary vote. 100 years later, the idea of a Labor Party as a political force potent enough to hold the majority of seats in a parliament is unremarkable. Over the past 3 decades, in fact, federal Labor has been in government more often than in opposition. But 100 years ago, a majority Labor government was unthinkable. Fisher's election victory came just 6 years after Chris Watson's minority Labor government had been called a monstrous travesty, a political freak. After the Watson government fell, its members were characterised by Alfred Deakin as ill-bred urchins dragging, kicking and screaming from the ministry, with the inescapable implication that in this metaphor, the Conservative parties were the well-bred, responsible adults doing the ejecting.